Okay, thank you. And thank you for planning this. This is a great idea, and I know it was your idea. So love collaborating, and thanks for hosting. My name is Linda Conroy, and I am an herbalist. You can see my cover page here has my website, moonwiseherbs.com. I'm an herbalist, I'm a forager, I'm also a community organizer. I organize the Midwest Women's Herbal Conference, which is an educational event that happens annually. And this year will be May 27th through 29th in Almond, Wisconsin. And so there's lots of different learning opportunities along the way. This program is really fun and exciting because when my seed catalogs start arriving, this is what I start thinking about is planning my herb garden and what am I going to do? So what kind of elements what I'm going to do is talk about the kind of things I think about as I'm planning my herb garden and what I might like to introduce, what I might like to grow, what elements I need to get started. So yes, please feel free to pop questions into the chat. Also, if you have a question and you want to, I don't mind if you unmute yourself as well. If I hold you off, it's because I'm going to answer your question as I'm going along. We have 1 hour to cover a lot of material, so I'm going to go through this, and so if I put you off, it's not because I won't answer your question. I think we'll get all the questions answered. So, let me see my okay, we're working here. So here's my introduction page. Like I said, I'm an herbalist, gardener, wild forager, community organizer. And in this photo, I'm actually harvesting St. John's wort or Hypericum perforatum. And so I'm an herbalist. So I'm going to talk about culinary herbs, but I'll also talk about medicinal herbs. And sometimes people don't think about growing some of the unusual medicinal herbs, but I will talk about that as we go along because I love growing them. And because I'm a wild forager, I just think of the whole world as my garden. I don't really have like parameters or boundaries around what my garden is. It's pretty extensive. So even when I forage for herbs, I treat the foraged herbs as my garden. So one of the things I like to think about as I'm going into something is like, why would I do this? Why, excuse me, why would I grow herbs? What would be a reason to have herbs growing around me? So the first reason is for culinary purposes. Excuse me. They're delicious. They add unique flavor to food. So, we can have, and we'll talk about specific herbs, but just all the culinary herbs that we can put into our food. Um, and having them for to add to your dishes is a great reason. Then for medicine, having things growing, mint for example, to ease an upset stomach, and just so many different herbs that we can incorporate in for medicine as well. And then another reason is it's easy and satisfying. Herbs are probably one of the easiest things to grow. Once you kind of have the foundation down, I always joke that, I'm not really the best vegetable grower. I mostly leave that to other people, but herbs, I've got that. Herbs are really pretty simple. I grow some vegetables, but it's not my main thing. And then they're aromatic and they smell good. Even when you're out in the garden, it's amazing to me. You brush up against a mint or a holy basil or lavender, rosemary, you just get this scent and it's so pleasant and it's enjoyable. Also, pollinators are attracted to herbs very strongly. So bees and butterflies and all kinds of pollinators that would be attracted to them. They're nutritious. Herbs have a lot of nutrition to them. And as an herbalist, I'm very interested in increasing the nutrient density of my diet. And so I like them for that reason. And they add diversity. So, you're adding these different flavors as you go along. They can also keep pests to a minimum. So if you have some of the aromatic herbs, they'll keep some pests to a minimum. So those are some reasons that I've come up with. if anybody has any other reasons, you can drop them in the chat and give us some other reasons that you might have. I mean, there's probably a gazillion reasons to grow herbs. And so my buttons aren't cooperating this evening. There we go. Okay, so this is planning your herb garden. So the first thing you have to do is plan, no matter what you're doing. I saw somebody in the chat asked about container gardening, and I am going to talk about that because whenever I do this offer this program, people ask about container gardening, and herbs are great for container gardening. So I will talk about that. Now, whether you're growing herbs on a large scale or in containers and pots, you have to start with soil. That's your first thing. Herbs like rich soil. Most of them like a lot of rich soil with good drainage. So that's what you want to think about. And most herbs like full sun, although another question I get in this program all the time, which I will address as well, is, well, what if I have a shady area? And so I will give you some tips on different herbs you can grow in shady spots as well. But we have to start with soil. So I actually built a greenhouse on my property this year, and this little critter is living in my greenhouse right now. This rabbit. It's the friendliest, sweetest rabbit. It's a domestic rabbit, and she is fertilizing the raised beds in the greenhouse, as you can see right here. And so, yeah, you want soil, and you also want to make sure you have some good amendments for the soil. And so she's busy at work right now. She's out there. She's living in the greenhouse, enjoying herself. It's like a rabbit condo, and she is fertilizing the beds. So there are other things you can fertilize the bed with. You don't have to have a rabbit running around in your greenhouse or in your pots. You can go and get worm castings from a garden supply store. You can get manure from a local farmer. That's a great place. You can get cow, horse, chicken, goat. The nice thing I like, though, about rabbit, which is also true for goat, is it can go right into the bed. So you don't have to age it. But with cow and horse and chicken manure, you have to age it. So that's one of the things I really like I said, about goat and rabbit. So all that fertilizer, it's going into my raised beds in the greenhouses, I don't have to do anything. I just stir the soil up a little bit and I'm good to go. Bat guano. So you can purchase bat guano. I also put some bat houses up near my garden a couple years ago, and that's a great thing because bat guano or bat poop is good for the garden. And then composting. So I do, vegetable and food-based composting. So you want to either clean up or prepare a compost bin, and you can start preparing compost so you'll have that for your beds. And then you can also create a worm compost bin. So this is nice for people in small spaces or even in apartments. You can make a worm compost bin where you use the little red wiggle worms you can buy, and then you can put your compost into your bin, and you can keep that indoors in a small space. So if you don't have the space to do some of these other methods. But the thing with this time of year, you want to start thinking about this, and where are you gonna get these things? Where are you gonna acquire them? How are you potentially either gonna make them or purchase them? You want to start making your lists and get your sources together. I have somebody who delivers large piles of compost here as well, and soil. So that's another thing that I'm thinking about, is making arrangements soon to get those things delivered. And somebody's asking about mushrooms, which, yes, I didn't mention those, but mushroom compost is great. And, mushrooms decaying, you can actually garden with mushrooms. You can bring mushrooms into your garden space, absolutely. And I'm actually kind of surprised I didn't add that, but I will be adding it. Thanks for the question. So, mushrooms are wonderful nourishment for the soil, for us, for the whole kaput and caboodle. Okay. Why am I my fruit? There we go. Okay, and so then if you're going to grow herbs, you need to decide, am I going to start with seeds? And I'll talk about starting with starts as well, but first we'll talk about seeds. So this is another sourcing if you haven't collected your own seed, which I really encourage people to, if you start growing herbs, I encourage you to start thinking about, for, future years, collecting your own seed, because it's very easy to collect herb seeds. They're forgiving, they're easy. You just have to make sure they're mature. Does anybody know what seeds are here in my photo? And they aren't worms, they're seeds, honestly, I promise you.
Is it calendula?
Calendula, yes, these are calendula seeds. Great, nice. Um, so the first time I saw these, I was like, these are seeds? That's just crazy, right? But yes, they are seeds. So so you want to, source your seeds. And I want to back up a second. I just saw somebody dropped for soil amendment coffee grounds into the chat. And yes, coffee grounds as well. And sometimes you can go to your local coffee shop and they'll save them for you. So yes, absolutely, that's another one we can add to our list for soil amendment. And so starting with seeds, if you can collect your own, calendula seeds are easy to collect. So that's, it's very simple. And they do self-sow. Calendula is a self-sowing annual, so it will plant itself back into the garden if you let it go to seed, and you can collect them as well. Now, if you're going to purchase seeds, there's lots of different places. Obviously, you can just go to your local garden store and harvest harvest seeds from the garden store. No, you can collect, purchase them. A lot of times they have your typical seeds like sage and rosemary and thyme, and the common herbs that we think of. I put here a couple other sources, because if you want to grow more unusual herbs, and especially medicinal herbs, you might want to look at some of these other sources. So one of them is a place called Strictly Medicinals. And even if you don't purchase anything from them, order their catalog, because their catalog has great instructions on how to grow a lot of medicinal herbs. They tell you what the requirements are for the seeds, they tell you what kind of light they like, what kind of soil, etc. And they focus on a lot of herbs that are unusual and mostly medicinal. Another company that's really good is Richter's Herbs, and they sell both seeds and starts. So you can buy either seeds or starts depending on what you're prepared to do. With seeds, if you don't have a place, if you don't have either lights or a greenhouse, that's why I built a greenhouse last year, so I can do more seed starts. If you don't have that, then you may want to, purchase starts. But if you have a place where you can actually grow seeds, then you can order the seeds. Of course, it's a lot less expensive to order the seeds than the starts. Seed Savers Exchange, which is in Iowa, they sell a lot of herbs. They are more focused on vegetables, but they do sell herbs. United Plant Savers, they don't necessarily sell herbs, but they do. If you become a member of their conservation organization, if you become a member, they do send you starts and seeds and things like that. So if you're a member, you can get bonuses from them, usually. And I'm going to talk about them in a little while, because they are focused on at-risk and endangered plants. And I really encourage us to grow those plants if we can, if we have the right kind of space to do that. So they can help you with growing those, with getting seed, with getting starts. And then Prairie Nursery is another good one. A lot of prairie plants are medicinal and have healing qualities. So when we think about, and culinary purposes as well. So when we think about growing herbs, we can stretch our idea about what an herb is a little bit, from our typical basil, sage, which I'm all for those, don't get me wrong. but we can stretch it out into some of the other herbs, the more medicinal herbs. So the catalog, I just want to, I saw people asking about that. Strictly Medicinals is the catalog that I recommended, and do get that catalog. I can't believe how much information they have packed in this little catalog for growing, for, starting seeds. They do sell some starts as well. And they tell you the healing qualities of the herbs, and a little bit about how to utilize them. So it's a little booklet that's, they send to you for free. I highly recommend it. Okay. And so then your other option, of course, is to start with plants. Somebody else will do the seed starting work. When I first started working with herbs, so I've been a practicing herbalist now for almost 30 years, which really, every time I think about that, I'm like, well, has it been 20 years, 25 years, 30? It's been almost 30 years. It's a long time. And so when I first started doing this work, I worked for a medicinal herb nursery where we grew from seed starts medicinal herbs for store like natural health food stores and places like that. And it was really amazing to watch these plants come up and learn them when they're just real teeny tiny starts when they first emerge. It's incredible to know them from that place all the way to their, full growth habits. And so even if you can start one pot of seeds, like even if you don't want to do all your herbs, it's really fun to just do at least one pot of seeds and see them go from that emergence to a full plant. So I encourage everyone to give that a try. But if you're not going to do a bunch of starch, you can purchase plants. And like I said, the sources I gave you, Richter's and Strictly Medicinals, they sell starts. A lot of the natural health food stores in this area where I live, which is just south of Madison, Wisconsin, will also sell starts. You'll find them at farmers markets. There's all sorts of places. Does Oregon have a farmers market? I haven't checked that out. I know a lot of the Stoughton has a farmers market, and I know other areas do as well. So those are other places where you can find starts. Um, and nurseries, of course, they carry starts as well. And finding the native herbs and medicinal plants, that can be a little trickier. So, the Prairie Nursery and Seed Savers Exchange, and then some of your obscure nurseries might have them as well. So you might have to do a little more digging if you're interested in growing some of the more unusual herbs and plants. Okay. So there's so many ways to grow herbs, and that's where you have to, when you're planning your herb garden, you have to look at your space and say, what kind of space do I have? What do I want to do? I actually bought a little farm and about 2.5 years ago, and I just keep adding because I have so much space. I'm actually going to show you an overview of my property in a little bit in one of the slides, because one of the ways you can plan is to draw out what your space looks like and then start looking at how you can add herbs into your space. Whether you have a small space or maybe you just have a balcony and you're going to put some pots, you can still draw it out, or you have a larger property. Either way, it's a good idea to plan and think about what you're going to do. So, are you going to create new beds? Are you going to use borders? Do you want rock gardens? Do you want to like to create a retaining wall place where you'll retain more heat? I saw somebody mentioned early in the chat when we first hopped on something about having difficulty growing rosemary. And in our climate where I live, and anybody who lives in in my general area, rosemary is tricky because it actually doesn't like to get its feet wet, and it needs to be a little warmer than the temperatures are here. And so You can optimize growing rosemary by creating a microclimate where maybe it's up against a retaining wall or against a house where it's warmer, and then making sure it has really good sandy soil so it gets good drainage, and really, making sure that it's covered or that it has a lot of good mulch around it in the winter. So you can do things with those herbs, and some people will keep rosemary in a pot and just bring it inside. Sometimes it doesn't do so great either because it doesn't like to be dried out. With rosemary, you have to think sea spray. So you have to mimic sea spray because that's what it likes. It likes to be by the ocean and it likes to get splashed every once in a while. So you can get a little spray bottle with a little bit of salt water in it and spray it because overwatering it is problematic, underwatering it is problematic. So rosemary is a little tricky in this region. I used to live out west and I had a rosemary hedge right outside my door. It grew all year long and I definitely miss it. So, if you want herbs for culinary purposes, it's a really good idea to have that herb garden right outside your door of your kitchen so you can easily access and go and get them. Because if you have to, like my largest garden is, a little bit away from my house. So if I'm cooking something and I have the stove on, I'm not going to run to the main garden and go and get herbs because I'll probably burn whatever's in the pan if I do that. So it's really nice to have some herbs right nearby, right where the kitchen is. Some herbs are annuals and others are perennials. So that's another thing, do you want to have a perennial garden, or do you want to have an annual garden, or do you want to have a perennial and an annual garden? And of course, there are biennials too, where some plants have a 2-year lifespan. So that's another thing to think about when you're planning your garden. And with herbs, you really only need a few plants. You don't need a whole lot, especially with sage and thyme, like it'll spread, and oregano, like you'll end up with a lot of herb. And in future sessions, we're going to talk about what you can do with all of that plant material that you acquire. Um, so somebody's saying that they brought rosemary inside after summer was over, placed it on the windowsill, and it's still alive. Yay, good for you. It is pretty thirsty though. Yeah, and you need to really, it's a fine line. I hope it makes it through the winter. Sometimes I'll have them and they'll be making it and then they don't. So, but I have had them make it through the winter. And one year I had them in a greenhouse where I used to live, and it wasn't a heated greenhouse, but it was warm enough because it was against the house, and it actually flowered. So that was exciting that my rosemary flowered, because sometimes people will say, "I didn't even know rosemary flowered." It does. It gets really beautiful flowers on it. Okay. So there are different approaches to growing. So you can do raised beds, and this would be nice if your kitchen was right in here. You could have a really nice raised bed right outside your kitchen. So that's a great way to grow herbs. It's nice to grow herbs at a height where you can easily harvest them and collect them. So as you're thinking, and this could be made from wood, it could be made from, stone or rock or brick, whatever it is that you would like. And then one of my favorite herb gardens is a spiral garden. So this is really fun to create. And it has a couple different purposes, which is neat. So it rotates up. So you keep adding soil and you put your either bricks or rocks, and the herbs that you put up at the top of the garden are the herbs that would need a lot of drainage and get direct sun. And then the herbs that you, in subsequent layers, you actually put herbs that, will tolerate a little bit more wet. And maybe the ones in the back don't need quite as much sun. They can tolerate a little bit more shade. So when you're placing the herbs in the spiral, you're thinking about these things like what herb will do well here. And then, you plant them and they just take off. So here is a spiral garden that some of my students and I built um, a number of years ago. And, you can see we built the garden and we installed the plants. Rosemary's at the center here. I was looking, I was like, what plants did we put? This is a long time ago. So it's like, what plants did we put in here? Um, and I know there's basil in here and calendula that looks like calendula, some chives. Thyme is really nice in these gardens to put in between the rocks. I'll do that a lot of times. So um, these gardens are really fun to build. And again, you can put them pretty close to the kitchen. And I know this year we're going to build one of these on my property. I've built them with my students on lots of other people's property, and I have yet to build one on my current property. So we will be likely building one this year. So there you have your spiral garden. And then somebody had asked about this container gardening. Absolutely. Herbs do really well in containers. And a funny story, I actually am getting ready to do a presentation for a conference on the herb comfrey. And comfrey is a healing herb that we utilize a lot in the herbal world. And it's all dormant right now. It's not emerging from the ground. And one of my current apprentices, I was talking to her and she's like, "Oh, I have a comfrey plant in a pot. Do you want to borrow it?" Because when I do my video on the plant, I'd like to have the plant there. So I borrowed her comfrey plant in a pot and I have it here. And I'm going to utilize it in my video. So you really can even have them, over winter. A lot of the herbs will do fine if you put them in pots and you can, take them in and out and have them available throughout the year. So
Mhm.
don't be afraid to put them in pots for, and you can put them on your patio. You can put them back in the ground and then dig them up too. Some people will do that. So we're going to go back to preparing beds and soil, because one of the things is whatever you're growing, whether it's in a pot, in a raised bed, in a field, it's only as good as the soil that you grow it in. So it's a good idea to layer, and this is called sheet mulching, layering. Some people call it lasagna gardening, and I'm a big fan of this technique. So you have your existing soil, and then you can use grass clippings or weeds, and then you put compost and cardboard and paper down. Um, and you're trying to cut off the light to the weeds that might be coming up. The grass clippings actually add warmth and heat. And so they actually heat up the compost and the soil and the weeds. And then the cardboard or paper, you can use newspaper too, cuts off the light and helps to kill off any weeds that are there. And then you can mulch on top of that. And then you're building soil and you're building your beds so that they're deeply nourished. And here's what this looks like. So you put the cardboard down, it could be newspaper, and then you would put your compost on top of that. And then you can either just let it be fallow for a couple months and let the cardboard start to break down, or you can dig holes and plant right into the cardboard, and you're going to put mulch on top of this, so you won't see cardboard. If you're going, "Oh, that looks awful," you won't actually see that, because you can put the mulch on top and you can see here, that's what it's going to look like. So this is a really nice technique for building soil. Herbs do really, really well when you build your soil this way, and it gets rid of a lot of the weeds that you might be struggling with. So this is a bed of oats, and I grow oats as an herb, as a healing herb. And so we created this bed. This is a bed where we did the sheet mulching, and we lined it with rocks, and we built the soil here, and then we planted the oats in the middle. And we actually planted, you can't see it real well because we planted some thyme plants and some sage and things around the edges, and this was early on, so they didn't have really come up yet, but we were creating that uh to have the culinary herbs there as well. And then when the oats get tall enough, then we harvest them and dry them for infusions, which are really nourishing when we make infusions and drink them on a regular basis. Excuse me. So this is an unusual herb that not everybody is going to grow, but I like to grow because I like to drink it a lot. And then this also not only is it an herb that I can harvest, it also helps to nutrify the soil, the roots from the oats. So you've got multiple things happening here. Excuse me. This is another area where we sheet mulched, and we actually created a prairie here, and we planted a lot of native herbs. Like we planted, there's some echinacea there. This was before we planted anything. This is the preparation of the bed. This bed was full of flowers and plants, and pollinators just loved it last year. This was last spring. So we'll be adding more amendment to this bed next year, and then this year, not next year, this year, and then we'll be planting more seeds, and we'll have a lot of the perennials that were in there will come back as well. So, planning all of this and thinking about having your materials so when it's actually time to do it, you're ready to do it. So this is an aerial view of my property, and I just wanted to show this to you because if you do have a larger area to grow, you can, this is from Google Maps, you can actually go in and take a photo or take a snapshot of your property. And then like over here, are you able to see my cursor? Okay, I wanted to make sure I wasn't just I wasn't only seeing it. I have a bunch of raised beds over here you can see that we grow in. And then I'm actually creating what we call guilds. So I'm creating communities of plants. Like here is there's a community of plants in different areas. And this here is my culinary herb bed that's nearest the kitchen, and it's has a retaining wall, and I've got oregano and sage. I also have lavender growing there because it's got the heat, and it's a retaining wall. And then I have a building here, and I also planted a bunch of wild onions along here, and ramps and wild leeks back along here. We also planted 100 wild leek bulbs behind. There's some trees back here which you can't see. But this is I really like this as a technique if you have more property to be able to look at what you're looking at. And then I can print this out and I can actually draw on it and start to write, what do I want to grow where? Because planning is, it's a really helpful thing to do when you're, looking at putting your garden together. Plus it keeps you occupied this time of year. It keeps you doing something. So so here are some commonly grown herbs that people like to grow. We have borage, which is this flower here. If you're not familiar with borage, it's very beautiful. And the flowers are edible. We put them in salads. Anise, basil, chervil. I'm sure lots of these you're familiar with, the dill and chives, cilantro. Oh, I have dill here twice. I only like dill and pickles, but I like a lot of it because I like pickles. Fennel, oregano, parsley, rosemary. This should say sage, not safe. I need a editor too. Tarragon, thyme. There's just so many herbs. These are some of the very common herbs that people grow in their sunny garden. Those herbs tend to like sun. And let's see. So here are some that tolerate shade really well. And this picture is of sorrel, actually, which is one that tolerates shade. So oregano, bee balm, parsley, sorrel, thyme. These herbs all do tolerate some shade. And when you look at shade, there's like partial shade, there's full shade. You have to know what you're looking at because these all like a little bit of sun at least. When you're growing them, these are more of the, Mediterranean herbs. But we can get into growing some understory herbs. So I'm going to show you two slides for the organization called the United Plant Savers. And I mentioned them earlier. They're a conservation organization, and they were set up to protect medicinal plants. And a lot of these plants on this list and the next list I'll show you, I'm not going to go over every one. I'm just going to point out a couple of them. Excuse me. A lot of these plants are used for herbal medicine, and a vast majority of them are grown in the understory underneath deciduous trees. So if you, even if you don't have a forest, you have a really nice tree, you can grow some of these herbs under your trees. Like for example, American ginseng is a medicinal plant that prefers shade. So if you have a shady area, this is a great plant to put in. Black cohosh also likes shade. These are all actually early ephemeral plants that get their sun before the deciduous plants leaf out, and then they do well in the understory of your deciduous forest or wooded area, or just your tree. Even if you're just a small place, you can plant these under your tree. So bloodroot is another one, and blue cohosh. Those first four all really like shade and understory, and they're all medicinal plants. Now echinacea likes sun. I'm sure probably some of you are growing echinacea and it prefers sun, so that would move into a more sunny place. But then some of these others like golden seal like shade, um, and slippery elm's a tree, so that's different. Wild yam grows in our area and like shade. So if I had mentioned earlier, if you become a member of this organization, they usually will send you seeds or plants and they'll talk to you about how to grow them. And if you really get interested, you can become a medicinal plant sanctuary if you're growing them and protecting them yourself. So it's kind of, you can just grow one or two for yourself, or you could become a community resource. So and here's another, this list is the ones that they consider endangered. And the big problem with these is that they harvest a lot of these, the root is the part of the plant that's harvested. So when you harvest a root, you kill a plant. And so these are endangered, at risk in the wild. So if you grow them, that's a really good thing because you're adding, to the conservation and supporting the plants. Now with this is their to watch list. These aren't quite endangered, but they are at risk. So it's same thing. These are going to be some of these plants are going to be plants that some of them prefer the sun, but some don't mind shade. Some of them don't grow in our area, but like lobelia does. Lobelia does okay in partial shade. And stone root will grow in gardens. So Baptisia, wild indigo does grow here as well. So we've got some of these plants will grow in our area. More of the other list they're more abundant in our area. Okay, so those herbs, the ones I showed you on these lists, these herbs are a little trickier to grow. They have different requirements. And another thing about them is a lot of these understory ephemerals, which I just think is an interesting fact, are pollinated by ants. And I just think that's so amazing. So, because the ants crawl up into the flower and then they spread the pollen around. So I just think that's kind of fun. But then, the hardier plants are our parsleys and our chives. I mean, these are so hardy. If you're growing them, they just come back. Once they're established, they just come back year after year. I saw somebody had asked about lovage, and lovage is one of my favorite plants to grow. I just love this plant. And this plant tastes like similar to celery. It's in the same family as celery, and it's easy to grow once you have it established. And I dry it, and this is something where one of our sessions is going to be, how do I prepare all of these herbs? What do I do with them? That's a couple sessions down the line. But with lovage, I will tell you what I do with it is I dry it, and all winter long, I just sprinkle it into soups and stews. And then in season, I put it in salads. I love it in salads. It's really delicious. So I plant big beds of this. I don't just plant one plant. I like to have big beds. And it does get tall. So that's another thing to think about when you're planting your herb garden is how tall do these plants get? So lovage gets quite tall, whereas, thyme is more, it spreads and it's lower to the ground. So you can think about stacking your herbs so that the taller herbs are in the back of your bed and the lower growing herbs are in the front and in between, everything in between. So, like calendula gets tall, but not quite as tall as lovage. So you could have calendula, I mean, you could have lovage in the back, calendula in the middle, and thyme in the front. Like, that would make a really nice bed. I'm just making that up right now off the top of my head. But that's the kind of thing you want to think about when you're planning your herb garden. Like, how can these plants, because they can coexist and they can grow together, and you can make it so that, that it's aesthetically appealing as well as accessible and easy to reach. And you wouldn't want to put lovage in the front and cut off the light to the shorter plants either. So you want to make sure everybody gets a little bit of light. So growing the uncommon herbs is just thinking about this, it's fun. You're going to get some culinary herbs, but also some medicinal herbs. They're going to look really interesting in your garden. Lovage is one of those plants people come into my garden and go, "Oh, what's that? I don't know that plant." But they can bring the unusual flavors to your table, as we said before, and they can contribute to your medicine chest. You can learn how to use them for minor cuts and scrapes and all that kind of stuff. So one herb that I really enjoy growing, and you can grow in fairly decent quantities, is calendula. It's a self-sowing annual. Once you plant it, if it likes where it is, usually, and you let it go to seed, it'll just keep planting itself. You can see it's really beautiful. It tends to be both orange and yellow. You can see there are some orange and some yellow flowers here on my tray. I have them drying here in this picture. And they're not a super tall herb, but they're kind of like mid-range in their height. And so you can, plant them along with other herbs. A lot of times I'll do a big bed of these, and then I'll also intersperse them with other plants as well. And we'll talk later in some of the other sessions about what to do with this plant. But in season, it's edible. So we, again, like borage, we put these flowers on top of our salads and they look really beautiful. Um, so you can work with those. Sometimes, and I have to apologize, but I have got to take you with me to get my cord because I'm gonna run out of battery. I didn't realize. So I'm gonna keep talking while I take you all with me. So the next herb I have here is elderflower, and sometimes we don't think about that as an herb because it's a bush or a shrub, but it is an herb. It's a healing.
Oh, well, it looks like we might have temporarily lost her. So let's just wait a moment, see what happens.
So elderflowers are a shrub, and so if you have a place where you need a shrub or a bush, elderflowers are really nice. And you can take cuttings from the wild, or you can get named varieties. So you can start reading about some of the different varieties. Some of them taste better than others. Some of them are better for medicine. Some of them, good for, you can make elder pies. The flowers make a nice tea. So while you're planning your garden, you can start reading about the different kinds of elders and you can start planning. And then violets are really wonderful herbs. They can be made into all kinds of culinary delicacies. They can just be eaten straight out. And we do utilize these topically and internally for medicine. So these are wonderful and easy to grow. Bee balm is another herb that I really like to grow in my garden, both the red and the wild. On the left we have Monarda fistulosa, And on the right, we have Monarda didyma. They're both edible. The one on the left is more medicinal. It has thymol in it, so it's antispasmodic for coughs. It also has some fungal fighting qualities. So you can, and what, like I said, we'll talk about some of that going forward, but it's nice to have the different colors. And bee balm does tolerate partial shade. So if you're looking for one of the herbs that you might want to put in your garden for partial shade, this is one. Sometimes people don't think about hops, but I always like to throw it in there. It's a vine, and if you have a place where you can, put something on a trellis or on a fence or something, this is a great herb to grow. And it's beautiful, and it smells good. And you could also try your hand at making beer, but it's also a good medicinal herb as well. This is one of my favorite medicine herbs. It's called elecampane. It gets really, really tall, and it's an aster. It looks like a giant sunflower, and we utilize the root for medicine. So this is one that I always have in the back of my garden. Again, because it's so tall, I put it in the back of my garden. Roses, people don't think of roses as herbs, but herbalists do think of roses as herbs. So we harvest the leaves and the petals and the fruit. And so growing your shrubs, oh, sorry, I'm having now a cat issue. Oh boy. So roses are great. And if you, are you able to see that? There we go. And so grow rose bushes. They have lots of you can make teas, you can put them in your those petals in your salad, the fruit in your teas and medicines. So grow roses. Nettle is another herb that does really well in wet soil and partial shade. It likes sun too, but it also is great in shade. I know some people are nervous around it, but you can dry it. It makes a great infusion, and you can eat it as a vegetable as well. So we'll talk about, again, all the ways you can utilize nettle down the road, but you can start planning. If you have a spot where you can plant it, you can start planning for that. Plantain is a wild plant that's used to heal cuts and scrapes. And you don't necessarily have to plant this because it's abundant, but if you want to, you can. And it's one of my favorite healing herbs that I like to have around. And another thing to think about is, as you are planning, you want to plan about places where you can store your herbs and places where you're going to dry them. So start thinking about these things as you're planning, so that when, I know when I first started doing this, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I have to dry herbs. Where am I going to do that? Right when I needed to do it. But what you want to do is start thinking about it ahead of time so that you're ready for that. So I have a list here of some of my favorite books and things like that. And I wanted to just make sure we have some time now for some questions. Anybody has any questions that they would like
Can
to?
you put that list back up again
Yeah,
of your favorite books?
there we go. I do see one question. Touching nettle with bare skin can help with arthritis. Yes. So they people do touch it, and it gets the circulation going, and it kind of numbs your joints. And it's been utilized as to ease the pain of arthritis for a long time. It's very common information. Yeah. Any other questions? People feel like you can start planning and thinking about your herb garden. I mean, we have an hour. Of course, we can talk about this for hours, but I just wanted to throw some ideas out at you and get you thinking about planning and starting to get ready for your herb garden. But I'm happy to answer any questions if there's something. Which herbs are deer resistant? So, um, a couple things about deer resistance. One of the things I like to do is plant extra for the deer. because the deer do like it. So if you plant a lot of something, then they eat the edges and hopefully they won't eat the center. Um, so that's one thing. Marigolds, sometimes people also will, not that we utilize marigolds as an herb, but the other thing is to plant marigolds around your beds so that because they don't like them, so then they don't aren't as likely to go in. So that's those are some tips around trying to keep the deer out of your beds. Yeah. I see somebody talking about growing episode, which is delicious. I love that herb. It's really wonderful. So that's great that you're growing that. See what else. What's one of your biggest mistakes you learned from? As far as growing herbs, biggest mistakes, I don't know if I've made any giant mistakes, but not building soil and trying to plant things where I needed to really help the plants and help the soil. So I think that's why I wanted to talk to you about that, is making sure you start out with good soil and you're amending the soil and that you're, really thinking about where you're putting the herbs. And so I don't think I have any major uh mistakes with growing herbs. Like I said, herbs are fairly forgiving. I have somebody talking about their neighbor's spray lawn with chemicals, hesitant to plant directly in the ground. Yeah, so you can do raised beds for sure. Depending on how big your property is, I know I did live in a house where people were spraying on both sides, but my property, I could grow in the center of my property and stay away from the edges is what I did there. But I also did have raised beds, so yes. How do I learn about foraging? So you can get books, you can go on foraging walks. I'll be leading some foraging walks if you live near me. And I do that every year throughout the seasons. But if you live somewhere else, you might find someone who does that. You can also, some foragers will come to your property and walk around with you. So those are some ideas. Can wood chips be used for mulch? Yes. But make sure they're not dyed or chemically treated, but wood chips can be used for mulch. And I agree, Sam Thayer's books are great. I just saw him, spent some time with him last weekend. He's a wonderful forager from northern Wisconsin. And do you have any recommendations for foragers that come to your property? So it depends on where you live. So email me and if I can tell you some people, there's different people. Black walnut wood chips are tricky. Black walnuts can actually be problematic. They interfere with other plants, some of the oils or the chemicals that are in the tree. So it depends. Some plants will do okay with black walnut, but a lot won't. I might have missed some questions there. I don't know if anybody else can see them. I think, did you?
Yeah. So there was a question about how mint should be grown in a container, and are there any other plants that should be grown into a container?
Well, mints, a lot of people like to grow mints in containers so that they don't spread too much because they can just take over a garden bed. I mean, I don't do this, but I know people who take mints and take them in the pot and sink the pot into the ground so that the root system can't grow. I honestly don't grow tons of mint myself. There's some mints that grow in the wild, and I mostly wild harvest mints. I do grow bee balm, which is in the mint family, and I grow lemon balm, which is in the mint family, but I don't tend to grow a lot of peppermint or spearmint personally, but they can take over your garden beds for sure. So you can grow them in a pot and sink the pot in the ground or just keep them in the pot. That's fine too. Yeah.
And then there was a question about how to grow chamomile and which varieties are best.
Yeah. So chamomile, the German variety is the variety I usually grow, and it is an aster, and so it likes sun. Just think of it as a tiny sunflower when you're thinking about where to put it. So it likes sun and it likes good drainage. And so I usually grow it in raised beds because then nothing else really competes with it. And then it's easy to harvest when you have it in a raised bed. So that's how I like to grow chamomile myself. But, just like I said, think of it as a little tiny sunflower and then figure out where you want to put it.
There's a question about what are the best herbs for dogs?
Well, it depends if that's for nutrition or if it's for healing something. That's a whole complicated conversation, honestly. But a lot of the culinary herbs you can powder as an antioxidant and put it in their food if they like it. It wouldn't hurt anything. A lot of dog foods have like rosmarinous oil in it, and you'll see those herbs in pet foods. Um, so, those are some of the things you can add to their food. But as far as like healing, that's a whole other thing. So I guess the question is dense and complicated. Yeah.
Then there was also a question about companion planting. What herbs do best together and what herbs do best with vegetables?
Well, the truth of the matter is herbs do really well with vegetables. It really all herbs. The main companion thing to think about is the height of the plants, what I was talking about before. Because if grow something that's going to shade out something else, that becomes problematic. But basil and tomatoes love growing together, and if you're going to eat them together, you might as well grow them together. So, and there are different ideas. People have different ideas about this concept, what grows well together, and it's going to vary in different people's gardens too. But herbs tend to grow really well with vegetables in general. So I don't really have any major rules about it. I just try to look at it, what's aesthetically pleasing, what's not going to shade out something else. So yeah. Japanese beetles and basil, it's tricky. You have to pick them off. That's the main way to get rid of them. It really is. There is a insect repellent that's made from chamomile oil. And so you could possibly, I haven't tried this with Japanese beetles, but I think you could, is to make a really strong chamomile tea and put it in a spray bottle, and that might discourage them. So that would, if you wanted something natural, that would be worth a try that you could make yourself. All right. Anything else? I know we're just about at the end of our time, but I'm happy to answer any other questions, and um, looking forward to the next session, which is starting your herb garden. See if there's anything.
There was one more question. Any resources? Are there any resources that you listed that give a step-by-step directions for spiral gardens?
You know what I would suggest? There's lots of YouTube videos. And because people build them with all different materials, people build them with all different sizes. And so I would just go watch a few YouTube videos and then design your own, because once you see a couple of them built, every location that I've built them had different requirements. We built one on a farm that had a lot of its own quarry rock, and we used all rock from the property. It was really fun. So you just have to see what you have and what materials you're going to be using, and look at how people build them and go from there. So yeah, I would just watch a lot of YouTube videos.
Okay, I'm gonna go with one last question here, and it's that Tulsi is hard to find. Do you have suggestions for sourcing that?
Well, if you're trying to find, are you trying to find the seed, the plant, or the dried herb? What what are you looking for? Whoever asked that question.
She hasn't provided additional info, so not
Okay,
sure.
so I'll just tell you real quickly about growing since we're that's what we're focused on. If you want seed or starts, Richter's Herbs or Strictly Medicinals has seeds and they have plant starts. You can get a lot. Actually, it's a mint, so it's in the mint family. It grows so easily, and it's an annual here, but it grows really well, and you can get several harvests of it from one plant. So buy a bunch of plants or a bunch of seed, and just you can even start the seeds right in the bed in the spring when it's warm enough. But you're better off getting plants because they'll grow faster. But you can get a lot of plants if you order them early enough and grow it yourself. It's very easy to grow.
Okay, I'm sorry, just one more question. Do certain fertilizers give soil different characteristics?
Certainly they do. The thing is that you don't want the reason you have to age like some of the manures is you don't want um too much acid in the soil. So you want to get something that's aged, something that's well y- so they are going to give different qualities, but a good mixture. So you want a good mixture of some soil, some really good soil, some compost, some fertilizer, natural fertilizer. Don't just use fertilizer, but a little bit can also go a long way.
Okay, that was actually it now. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you, Linda, for the wonderful information. I will be sending out an email with some links and some stuff either tomorrow or Monday. Thank you, everyone. And again, thank you, Linda.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. And I apologize about getting kicked off, but I'll be plugged in next time. So good night, everybody.